In this video, I'll explain fault tolerance and how it can be used to provide zero downtime protection for critical virtual machines. And that's really what fault tolerance is all about. It's about uh, giving you 100% uptime with no data loss, no transaction loss for critical virtual machines by mirroring that virtual machine onto a secondary host. So there's going to be multiple running instances for that virtual machine that ensures that they're always going to be exactly identical. And there's essentially what we call a hot standby, right? There's another copy of this VM running on another host, ready to take over at all times. So if a host fails, the primary VM will immediately fail over to the secondary VM, right? And then a new secondary will be spawned to re-protect that virtual machine, just in case there's another failure that occurs after that. And we can even place the secondary VM at a different data store to provide an additional level of protection. So let's take a look at how this works. All right, here's my primary VM running on host ESXi01. And my virtual machines files are located on this data store. We'll call it data store. Here's data store 1. So I've got my virtual machine and my set of virtual machine files, and my VM is fine. It's up and running. Everything's good. And then I go ahead and I create, number one thing I have to create is a network, a fault tolerance logging network between those two ESXi hosts, right? And the purpose of this fault tolerance logging network is to basically track the state of my primary virtual machine and make sure that the secondary virtual machine is kept exactly the same. All right. So if I go into this primary VM and I open a console and I start moving my mouse around, the exact same thing is going to happen immediately in my secondary VM. Right? That's the purpose of this fault tolerance logging network, is to make sure that the state of those virtual machines is kept exactly the same. And same thing with those virtual machine files. So now I've got a primary and a secondary VM that are completely identical. And if the primary fails, or if a host fails and the primary goes down, the secondary will take over immediately, right? So let's talk about what happens when a host fails. So again, here's my primary VM running on ESXi01, my secondary VM running on ESXi02. And now I have my failure, right? ESXi01 goes down and the primary VM goes down with it. Well, what's going to happen at that point is the secondary instance on ESXi02 will immediately take over, will become the primary, and then to re-protect itself, a new secondary instance will be spawned on some other ESXi host. So now, even if ESXi02 fails, there's still that level of protection there for that virtual machine. Now, the only thing you have to kind of think about with fault tolerance is, what if something happens at the guest OS level, right? So for example, let's say that we have the Windows blue screen of death, right, in our primary here. Something happens within Windows that creates a problem. Well, the bad news is fault tolerance is going to immediately replicate that change to the secondary virtual machine. So fault tolerance does not give us any protection from a failure within the guest operating system. And the main thing you want to bear in mind for fault tolerance is, number one, that it's zero downtime, right? It's meant for really important virtual machines that require 100% uptime. And it's very resource intensive, so it's not like high availability. High availability is designed for protecting entire clusters of hosts and protecting a lot of VMs, right? With fault tolerance, we're picking and choosing a few critical VMs and giving them this 100% uptime protection. Right? So fault tolerance is not really meant for all virtual machines, right? AHA is kind of like your blanket protection for all VMs, and then we'll pick and choose certain critical VMs that require fault tolerance, right? So fault tolerance gives us 100% uptime, whereas high availability requires virtual machines to boot up on other hosts and has downtime involved. Fault tolerance keeps a primary VM on one host and a secondary VM host on a different ESXi host and data store. And if there is a host failure that occurs, the primary VM immediately fails over to the secondary with no downtime. And then a new secondary will be respawned to re-protect this virtual machine after failover.